Hi everyone, I'm Alice.
And I'm Ben.
And this is
Waterfront Wednesdays,
brought to you by
Boston Harbor Now.
This week we are joined by special guest Ben Lynch, the longtime section chief of the Waterways program at the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection, a.k.a. MassDEP.
Now retired,
but still the unquestionable expert at navigating and applying Chapter 91. And although we've talked on this blog before about filled land, Chapter 91, Harbor Walk, and special agency acronyms, we still thought it was worth it to bring in an expert like Ben who could really help us navigate the development that's happened all along the Massachusetts coastline and what he's been thinking about it.
Well, I'm excited to be here and to discuss what we've done and what I think the program will continue to do.
Let's start by putting the Waterways program in context.
Most of our work is focusing on applications that come in for projects that want to build either on flowed or filled tidelands.
So anywhere that the waterfront has been filled in over time, so where there was like an island and a salt marsh, they just kept filling it in, or on a pier that like sticks out in the water, all of that stuff, people apply for a Chapter 91 license.
That's right. They come in and essentially what we do is make sure that the building is appropriately scaled, has the right uses, and has good public access.
And it's not just you making those decisions.
No, we have a small staff, and it's a very collaborative staff. So we would get an application, we would talk things over, we'd look at what we'd done in the past, consider new changes, and write a license with conditions.
What if not everyone agrees?
If not everyone agrees, it falls to the section chief to make the final decision. And in those cases, I would probably bring it up to the commissioner's office and to the secretary, just to let them know.
And initially, you're explaining to people, this is what it is to do Chapter 91, this is what it means to create the Harbor Walk here in Boston. How do you start that conversation?
The conversation starts usually with the application comes in. We would oftentimes have a pre-application meeting with the proposed developer. We would point out places where on the site they needed to change things. That's the benefit of a sort of a pre-application discussion. They'd get it up to the point where we believed it was a licensable project, and then we would begin the public process.
So you're working with this developer who typically has an architect on board, and you are helping them to design a built environment that protects public benefits.
Correct. We would make sure that they do the things that Chapter 91 does best, such as setbacks from the water, good public open spaces, ground floor, public uses, as well as good connections from a public way.
And that's great if you're in the know and you sort of know, oh yeah, that's on the waterfront, so I have some access. How do you tell people in general, hey, you're welcome to come into this space?
That's the harder part, and that takes good design. We often rely on good professional designers to do that, but our tools are things like excellent signage, benches, lighting, programming when and where appropriate, the kinds of things that are a cue to the public that this is a public space.
So there's building design, there's sort of site design like that wayfinding signage, and then you mentioned programming. Programming can welcome people out to the edge of the water, or it can sort of take up a lot of space and make it questionable. How do you deal with that as a regulator?
The programming is a harder thing to do because good programming has to be sustained, and I think the Waterways program, while we loved good programming because it really activated a site, the Waterways licenses themselves were better at the structure of public use to make sure that the public felt welcome. It was obvious that they could go there and enjoy it.
So most developers around Boston are typically used to working in a place where they can sort of do what they want. There isn't this layer of Chapter 91. When someone first comes into your office who's not used to all of this stuff, how do you walk them through the needs for public access?
You have this discussion. There are oftentimes There are other processes that precede Chapter 91, so when they get here, they know something about it, but oftentimes you have to sit down and explain to developers. Interestingly, it was more the smaller developers who didn't know much about Chapter 91. The bigger, sophisticated ones did get it, but when I started in 1994, it was really difficult because these were new. The development community hadn't seen them, they didn't know whether they would work. But over time, and especially with the building boom that's gone on in the last 15 years, the development community has seen that the requirements of public access really work. They make sites more active, more interesting, and more safer. And I think that makes their buildings more valuable.
Yeah, and I think initially when you described, there were people who weren't doing a lot on the ground floor. Like the ground floor was still really private in most places, but now ground floor retail, that's the new normal for a multi-story residential or multi-story commercial. Like you said, it brings that activation to it.
Right. I think that the requirement to have public ground floor uses really works well for both. It works well for the public and it works well for the development community too. And it has to be welcoming and it has to be active.
Yeah. So a non-water dependent use on Commonwealth-filled tidelands means there's a lot of public space rights, outside and inside.
And that all goes back to the Supreme Judicial Court who ruled on these things and basically said Commonwealth tidelands have the most public rights in them, so they have public open space, big setbacks from the water, and very active indoor uses to create a destination value for the public.
And only about 25% of a building's interior on the ground floor can be private in that context.
Correct. They can use that for a lobby to upper floor uses, but the remainder of the building, 75% of the interior, has to be restaurants, public restrooms, waiting rooms, lobbies, those kinds of things. Museums.
But if it's a private, non-water dependent use, they've got a few more flexibility things. They only have to do a little bit.
Right. For private tidelands, there are fewer public rights embedded in them. And so the most important part is the first 100 feet. So even on private tidelands, the first 100 feet from the water's edge back has to be entirely public, both interior and exterior.
What happens if you have a water-dependent use?
Water-dependent uses are interesting because many of them already exist, and it's the programs and the statutes intent is to protect and promote those water-dependent uses. So you may have an instance where you have competing water-dependent uses. One is an actual boatyard or marina or some kind of shipping thing. So what we try and do is to have the competing water-dependent use, which would be public access, respect that use and not frustrate them being able to operate the way they want to operate. And I think what we learned is that on those types of sites, what we would often do is have a point access. So you'd walk from the road to the water's edge and have a viewing area without all access along the waterfront. And we found that those are some of the most popular spots on the Harbor Walk. People love to watch fish being unloaded, boats being loaded and unloaded.
So in those contexts, the public benefit is the benefit of having this commercial use of the waterfront balanced with one place to go out for the public to see it and sort of touch the water, have that water experience.
Right. I think that's what you need to do. So it's a little different for a non-water dependent or a water dependent project.
Yeah. So over time, you have a whole bunch of precedents. You have all the cases you've decided on, all the licenses you've issued. You have these clear regulations. You have Supreme Court rulings. It seems like it should get easier, be more clear cut, but based on our conversations, it didn't.
No, it didn't, and I don't think it ever will. Projects are all different. The neighbors are different. The context is different. The uses are different, and so you really have to be fairly nimble in looking at this as a reviewer and saying what makes the most sense. How do we integrate these public rights on this site to make it so that the public's interests are served and they can comfortably with the public, but with the private property rights.
Yeah. Are there challenges in the future that you see coming for Chapter 91?
Personally, I think the biggest challenge is going to be climate change and resiliency. The regs always required that a building not flood, and they have engineering standards for that. But I don't think enough consideration was given to the other spaces, the public spaces that are the public benefits to these buildings. And so in the future, what if those public spaces become flooded? What happens as the high water mark moves landward? There are a whole bunch of questions that I think we need to rethink, and I think we probably will be doing that.
Yeah, what happens when a waterfront space wasn't the waterfront before?
Right.
But Chapter 91 isn't the only thing that's going to have an impact on this. There are other public regulators that are part of this conversation.
Right. In the city, we deal with the city all the time. We talk about this, but our sister agency, Coastal Zone Management, and then the Army Corps of Engineers as well play an important role. So the conversation will not be just with Chapter 9 on, it will be with all these agencies.
And then the private sector is doing some self-regulation in some ways.
Yeah, surprisingly, I come at it completely from the public side, but interestingly, the entities that finance these and insure these buildings have their own requirements to make sure that these buildings are sound and dry and accessible. So they've played a real role too.
But it'll come down to Chapter 91 to say, this is public and it needs to stay public. Sort of hell or high water.
Right, exactly. We'll need to figure that out.
At least the high water
Yeah,
part.
right.
Before we go, can you tell me what your favorite piece of the Harbor Walk is?
Well, Alice, you ask tough questions. I think I've had many favorite parts of the Harbor Walk in my 25 years at Chapter 91, but upon my retirement, I think my favorite part was watching the development of the Fort Point Channel. It's really become an exciting, active spot, and I think it'll continue to do so.
Well, you should go check it out. Ben Lynch told you to.
Yes, you should. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Ben Lynch.
And I'm Alice Brown.
You can follow the work of MassDEP on Twitter at MassDEP.
You can follow me at Fairy Fairy.
If you like this video, please share it with your friends or subscribe on the YouTube channel.
You can throw us a like or leave a comment below.
We'll see you on the waterfront.